At 9:30 in the morning on July 25, 1944, a sound unlike anything heard before in warfare rolled across the Norman countryside. More than 1,500 American heavy bombers, arranged in formations that stretched across the horizon like an endless steel river, released their payloads onto a rectangle of French farmland barely 6,000 yards long. The earth itself seemed to lift and shatter. Entire hedgerows vanished into columns of dirt and smoke. Trees that had stood for centuries were ripped from the ground and hurled through the air like matchsticks. On the ground below, the men of Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armoured formations in the German army, experienced what their commander would later call a glimpse of the apocalypse. Tanks weighing 30 tons were flipped onto their backs like toys. Artillery pieces disappeared into craters. Soldiers who survived years of combat on the Eastern Front had found themselves screaming, running in circles, driven beyond the limits of sanity by a bombardment that seemed to have no end. This was Operation Cobra, and in the hours and days that followed, the German army in Normandy would learn a lesson that would be repeated again and again until the final surrender in May of 1945. They were no longer fighting an army, they were fighting a system. The American system of combined arms warfare, the seamless coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power into a single integrated killing machine, represented a revolution in how wars were fought. It was not born of genius or sudden inspiration. It emerged from years of experimentation, from humiliating defeats that forced painful reforms, and from an industrial base that could turn doctrine into reality on a scale no other nation could match. By 1944, this system had achieved a lethality that made individual German courage irrelevant. To understand why German infantry struggled so terribly against this system, we must first understand how it came to exist. In September of 1941, more than 2 years before American soldiers would face German panzers in combat, the United States Army conducted the largest peacetime military exercises in its history. Across 3,400 square miles of Louisiana swampland and pine forest, nearly 500,000 soldiers maneuvered in war games that would shape the army that eventually invaded Europe. These Louisiana Maneuvers, as they came to be known, were the brainchild of Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, a driven and uncompromising officer who believed that the American army could only learn to fight by actually fighting, even if only in simulation. Two massive forces, designated the Second Army under Lieutenant General Ben Lear and the Third Army under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, clashed repeatedly under the watchful eyes of umpires who adjudicated every engagement with brutal honesty. The exercises were designed to test every aspect of modern warfare. Infantry divisions practiced coordinating with tank battalions, artillery batteries learned to mass their fires on fleeting targets. Engineers built bridges under simulated fire. Staff officers struggled to manage the logistics of moving and supplying hundreds of thousands of men across difficult terrain. The scenario pitted a defensive force against an aggressor equipped with armoured divisions, mimicking the threat posed by the German blitzkrieg that had just conquered Western Europe. The maneuvers exposed weaknesses that would have been catastrophic in actual combat. Reconnaissance was poor, with units frequently stumbling into enemy positions without warning. Tactical coordination between infantry and armour was almost non-existent. Air support, when it appeared at all, arrived too late to matter. Units that looked impressive on paper dissolved into confusion when faced with the friction of movement and combat. Communications broke down repeatedly. Supply lines became tangled. Commanders lost track of their subordinate units. Umpires tracked casualties with ruthless precision. In the subsequent Carolina maneuvers that November, they concluded that 91% of tanks adjudicated as destroyed had been killed by anti-tank guns, validating McNair's conviction that concentrated anti-tank weapons could defeat massed armor. But this finding also obscured weaknesses in tank infantry coordination that would prove costly in actual combat. Despite these problems, the maneuvers did something equally important. They identified the officers who could perform under pressure and removed those who could not. A young colonel named Dwight D. Eisenhower impressed observers with his organizational abilities while serving as chief of staff to Kruger's Third Army. George S. Patton demonstrated his aggressive instincts with armored forces. Omar Bradley showed steady competence in infantry operations. These men, unknown to the public in 1941, would command the armies that liberated Europe. More importantly, the maneuvers forced the army to confront its doctrinal shortcomings before those shortcomings could get men killed. The result was a series of field manuals that would govern how American forces fought. Field Manual 100-5, Field Service Regulations for Operations, published in May of 1941, established the principle that combined arms, the integration of all available combat power, was the foundation of American tactical doctrine. It declared itself the basic doctrine for the employment of the larger units of the Army of the United States. Yet doctrine written in peacetime is merely theory. The American system would receive its true education in the mountains of North Africa, where German veterans would administer a brutal lesson in the reality of modern war. In February of 1943, the United States Army met the Wehrmacht in sustained combat for the first time at a place called Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The results were devastating beyond what American planners had imagined possible. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, concentrated his experienced panzer divisions against American positions that were spread too thin and commanded too poorly to resist. The American commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had established his headquarters in a bunker carved from solid rock 70 miles behind the front lines. He rarely visited his forward units. He communicated in an idiosyncratic code that confused his own subordinates as much as any potential German listeners. His units were scattered across 30 miles of desert, in violation of every principle of concentration, each formation too weak to resist a determined attack, and too far from its neighbors to provide mutual support. Artillery batteries were positioned too far back to provide effective support to forward infantry. Air power, theoretically available in substantial numbers, remained grounded by weather and organizational confusion. The aircraft that did fly operated under a command structure that prevented timely response to battlefield emergencies. Reconnaissance was poor, and American commanders had little idea of German intentions until panzers appeared in their positions. The Germans attacked on February 19th, with the precise coordination that had made them masters of Europe. Panzers and infantry advanced together under cover of Luftwaffe aircraft. Artillery concentrations preceded each assault. Panzer grenadiers dismounted to clear positions that armor alone could not take. When American positions began to crumble, the Germans exploited every gap with speed and aggression that left defenders reeling. In 5 days of fighting, the Americans suffered approximately 6,500 casualties. Equipment losses were staggering, including hundreds of vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces. Entire units ceased to exist as organized formations. The defenders of one American position broke and fled so rapidly that German commanders could barely believe their success. The defeat sent shockwaves through the Allied command structure and raised serious questions about whether American soldiers could stand against German veterans. But Kasserine Pass did something else. It forced reforms that would transform the American army. General Eisenhower relieved Fredendall within days and installed George Patton to restore discipline and aggressiveness to the demoralized corps. Patton arrived like a thunderstorm, demanding proper uniforms, enforcing regulations that had been ignored, and making clear that he would tolerate neither cowardice nor incompetence. Bradley came with him as deputy, providing steady administrative competence alongside Patton's flamboyant leadership. More fundamentally, the disaster accelerated doctrinal changes that had been resisted by institutional inertia. The most important of these changes came in the relationship between air and ground forces. Before Kasserine, American commanders assumed they had a right to control the aircraft supporting their operations. Planes were parceled out to individual units like additional artillery batteries. The result was fragmentation, with air power scattered across the battlefield in penny packets too small to achieve decisive effect. In July of 1943, the Army Air Forces published Field Manual 100-20, Command and Employment of Air Power, a document that revolutionized American military thinking. Its opening line announced a principle that would have been heresy just months earlier. Land power and air power are co-equal and interdependent forces. Neither is an auxiliary of the other. Under this new doctrine, tactical air power would be centralized under an air commander who worked alongside, not underneath, the ground commander. Priorities were clearly established in order of precedence. First, achieve air superiority by destroying enemy aircraft in the sky and on the ground. Second, interdict enemy supplies and reinforcements before they could reach the battlefield. Third, and only third, provide direct support to ground troops engaged with the enemy. This seemingly bureaucratic reorganization would prove decisive in the campaigns to come. British Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, who worked closely with American commanders in the Mediterranean, observed the transformation with approval. He noted that Americans before Kasserine had found it difficult to understand that every general did not have a divine right to command his own private air forces. The new doctrine changed that attitude permanently. The American artillery system that emerged from the pre-war years and the North African crucible was perhaps the most lethal in the world. Its foundation was an innovation called the Fire Direction Center, developed at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill during the early 1930s. Before this system existed, coordinating the fires of multiple artillery batteries on a single target required laborious calculations and time-consuming communications. Each battery essentially fought its own private war, and massing fires from multiple battalions was so difficult that it was rarely attempted. The Fire Direction Center changed everything. All battery positions and potential targets were plotted on a common firing chart using precise surveying techniques. Mathematical calculations that had taken minutes, requiring logarithm tables and slide rules, could now be performed in seconds using pre-computed data and simple arithmetic. A forward observer with a radio could call in a target, specifying its location relative to known reference points, and within moments the Fire Direction Center could calculate firing data for every battery within range. This created a capability that German soldiers came to dread above all others. The time-on-target mission allowed American artillery to synchronize the firing of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of guns so that every shell arrived simultaneously. Batteries at different distances from the target would fire at precisely calculated intervals, with the most distant firing first. The shells from all batteries would converge on the target area at the same instant. The first warning a German unit received was also the last. There was no initial ranging fire, no opportunity to take cover, no chance to disperse. One moment silence, the next moment annihilation. By 1944, this system had been extended from battalion to division to corps level. An infantry company commander in the Normandy hedgerows, observing a German machine gun position through his binoculars, could pick up his radio handset and within minutes bring the concentrated fires of 8 or 12 artillery battalions crashing down on a single farmhouse. No other army in the world could match this capability for speed and massed effect. The forward observer teams that made this system work became the most hunted men on the battlefield. Typically consisting of an officer, a sergeant, a radio man, and several riflemen for security, these small teams moved with frontline infantry and armor, seeking observation points from which they could direct artillery onto enemy positions. German snipers and machine gunners learned to look for the radio antennas that marked these teams. Killing the forward observer was often more valuable than killing a dozen riflemen. But the Americans kept coming, kept calling, kept bringing down the thunder. The radios they carried, the SCR series using frequency modulation, were more reliable and harder to jam than German equivalents. The training their crews received was standardized and thorough. Replacements could slot into teams and begin functioning almost immediately. A lieutenant with a map, a pair of binoculars, and a radio had become more dangerous than a company of infantry. In late 1944, American artillery received another advantage that would prove devastating. The variable time fuse, also known as the proximity fuse, used a tiny radar transmitter to detonate artillery shells at a preset height above the ground rather than on impact. This airburst effect was far more lethal against troops in foxholes or behind cover, spraying fragments downward into positions that ground-burst shells could not reach. The fuse had been developed for anti-aircraft use but was restricted from ground combat until the German offensive in the Ardennes forced its release. On December 16, 1944, the day the offensive began, American artillery first used the fuse in ground combat. Within days, all restrictions were lifted, and from that point forward, American artillery became even more terrifying. General Patton later wrote that the funny fuse, as it was called, had won the Battle of the Bulge for the Americans. German soldiers caught in proximity fused concentrations were massacred in their positions with no possibility of shelter. In the skies above Normandy, the final element of American combined arms doctrine took lethal form. Major General Elwood R. Quesada, commander of EX Tactical Air Command, was an unusual figure among air officers of his era. While many airmen viewed ground support as a distraction from the more glamorous mission of strategic bombing, Quesada embraced it as the central purpose of his command. He located his command post next to General Bradley's headquarters, separated only by a hedgerow, so that coordination between air and ground could be continuous and immediate. Quesada spent hours discussing tactics with infantry and armor commanders, learning their problems and explaining what his aircraft could and could not do. He insisted that his pilots understand the ground war they were supporting, rotating officers between cockpit and headquarters so they could see the battlefield from both perspectives. This personal investment in the ground war made him unique among air commanders and invaluable to Bradley. Quesada's most important innovation transformed the relationship between American armor and American air power. He proposed installing VHF aircraft radios in Sherman tanks so that forward air controllers could ride with advancing armored columns and communicate directly with fighter bombers orbiting overhead. The SCR-522 radio, normally used only in aircraft, was fitted into the lead tanks of each column, alongside the standard SCR-508 that tankers used to communicate with each other. The result was what became known as armored column cover. 4 P-47 Thunderbolts would orbit above each advancing column, watching for German positions, vehicles, or reinforcements. When the column encountered resistance, the air controller in the lead tank would vector the fighters onto the target using clear voice commands. Within minutes, rockets, bombs, and .50 caliber machine gun fire would be tearing apart whatever stood in the way. The fighters could attack targets that tankers could not see, clearing ambushes and destroying artillery positions before they could fire on the column. This system debuted during Operation Cobra and proved immediately effective. Armored columns of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions advanced with their own personal air forces circling overhead. German defenders, already reeling from the carpet bombing that opened the operation, found that any attempt to concentrate forces or bring up reinforcements was immediately detected and savagely punished from the air. The conditions that made American combined arms possible simply did not exist for the German army by the summer of 1944. 3 catastrophic failures, in the air, in fuel, and in command, stripped German infantry of the supports they needed to fight on equal terms. Each of these failures reinforced the others, creating a downward spiral from which there was no escape. The collapse of the Luftwaffe over France was the most visible of these disasters. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Allies flew more than 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe managed just 319, losing approximately 40 aircraft, while the Allies lost 113 to all causes, including anti-aircraft fire. In June alone, German fighter losses over France exceeded 900 aircraft. By month's end, barely 400 operational fighters remained in all of France to oppose thousands of Allied aircraft. The men who flew those fighters were increasingly young and undertrained. Germany's experienced pilots, the aces who had dominated the skies of Poland, France, and Russia in the early years of the war, had been killed in the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front and the defense against Allied bombing. Their replacements received a fraction of the flight training that had been standard earlier in the war. Where pre-war pilots logged hundreds of hours before entering combat, new pilots in 1944 were lucky to receive 50. Fuel shortages made the training crisis worse. Every gallon of aviation gasoline burned in training was a gallon not available for combat operations. Fighter units were forced to choose between training new pilots and flying operational missions. Either choice led to disaster. Untrained pilots were easy victims for experienced Allied airmen. Undertrained squadrons could not effectively support ground forces, even when they managed to reach the battlefield. The effect on German ground forces was devastating. Movement in daylight became almost impossible. Reinforcements marching toward the front were detected by Allied reconnaissance and attacked by fighter bombers before they arrived. Supply convoys were shot to pieces on the roads. Artillery batteries that revealed their positions were hunted from the air and destroyed. German soldiers learned to move only at night and to hide during the day, but this reduced their mobility and initiative to a fraction of what they had possessed in earlier campaigns. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in Normandy, understood the implications better than most senior German officers. In his assessment written before D-Day, he had warned that fighting against an enemy with complete command of the air was like a savage fighting against modern European troops. His recommendation, to position panzer reserves close to the beaches where they could counterattack before Allied air power could intervene, was rejected by the German High Command in favor of holding reserves inland. The fuel crisis that paralyzed the German war machine was equally decisive, though less immediately visible. In May of 1944, the Allied strategic bombing offensive turned its full attention to Germany's synthetic oil plants. These facilities, which converted coal into liquid fuel through industrial processes, had become essential to German military operations because access to natural petroleum was limited and increasingly threatened. The results of the bombing campaign were catastrophic. Synthetic fuel production fell from 316,000 tons in May to 107,000 tons in June to just 17,000 tons by September. In 4 months, Allied bombers destroyed more than 90% of German synthetic fuel capacity. Aviation gasoline production collapsed even faster. From 175,000 tons in April, output fell to 30,000 tons in July and 5,000 tons in September. This single statistic explains much of what happened in the skies over France. Even if Germany had possessed unlimited aircraft and unlimited pilots, there was simply no fuel to fly them. The effects rippled through every branch of the German military. Tank crews received less training because there was no fuel for exercises. New drivers got behind the controls of 45-ton Panthers, having driven for only a fraction of the hours that their predecessors had logged. Panzer divisions sat immobilized in their assembly areas because there was no fuel to move them to the front. At critical moments in the Normandy campaign, armored reserves that might have thrown back American advances were stuck hundreds of miles from the fighting, their tanks drained and waiting for supplies that never arrived. Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, understood that the oil campaign represented a mortal threat to the German war machine. In a letter to Hitler dated June 30, 1944, he wrote that the enemy had succeeded in destroying 90% of aviation gasoline production. He warned that only speedy recovery of damaged plants could avert total collapse. But the Allies continued bombing, hitting repaired facilities as soon as they resumed production, and recovery proved impossible. Without fuel, nothing else mattered. The third failure was in command, and it was perhaps the most unnecessary of all. German generals in France in 1944 were not fools. They understood their situation with painful clarity. But the command structure imposed by Adolf Hitler prevented them from responding rationally to the crisis they faced. The dispute over how to defend against the expected Allied invasion had never been resolved. Rommel, drawing on his North African experience of Allied air power, wanted panzer reserves held close to the beaches. He argued that large armoured formations could not survive the journey from inland assembly areas to the coast under constant air attack. Better to have one panzer division in position on the first day than 3 panzer divisions arriving piecemeal over the following week. Rundstedt, the senior commander in the west, and General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Group West, disagreed. They wanted reserves concentrated inland for a decisive counterattack after the Allies had committed their forces and revealed their main effort. This was traditional German doctrine, proven in campaigns from Poland to Russia. Hold the enemy, identify the main thrust, and counterattack with concentrated armour. Hitler, characteristically, imposed a compromise that satisfied no one and guaranteed failure. Some panzer divisions went to Rommel for immediate response. Others were placed in a central reserve under Hitler's personal control, requiring his explicit permission before they could move. This arrangement meant that the reserves were neither positioned forward for immediate counterattack nor massed for a decisive blow. On the morning of D-Day, this arrangement produced paralysis at the moment when decisive action was most needed. When reports of the landings reached German headquarters, Hitler was asleep. His staff, trained to defer to his authority in all matters, refused to wake him. The panzer divisions that might have counterattacked the vulnerable beachheads during the first critical hours sat motionless, awaiting permission that did not come until afternoon. By then, Allied air power had made movement in daylight suicidal, and the beach defences had already failed. This micromanagement continued throughout the campaign. Division commanders were forbidden to retreat, even when their positions had become untenable, and continued resistance meant only pointless sacrifice. Counterattacks were ordered without regard for the forces available to execute them or the conditions they would face. Reinforcements were sent piecemeal to sectors where they could be destroyed in detail rather than concentrated for decisive effect. When Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was asked by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel on July 1st what should be done about the deteriorating situation in Normandy, his response captured the despair of professional soldiers, serving a leader detached from reality. Keitel asked what they should do. Rundstedt replied, "Make peace, you fools." He was relieved of command the next day. The collision between the American combined arms system and German defensive capabilities occurred most brutally in the hedgerows of Normandy in June and July of 1944. The bocage country, as the French called it, consisted of small fields bordered by earthen embankments topped with dense vegetation. These hedgerows had stood for centuries, some since Roman times, dividing the Norman landscape into a maze of tiny compartments. For German infantry, the bocage offered ideal conditions for defensive warfare. Machine gun teams dug into opposite corners of each field could create overlapping fields of fire that made crossing open ground suicidal for attackers. Mortars registered on predictable approach routes could devastate infantry attempting to breach the hedgerows. Snipers hidden in the thick vegetation could pick off officers and radio operators with impunity. Anti-tank teams armed with Panzerfausts could ambush Shermans at ranges where American crews had no chance to react. For American forces, the bocage negated many of their hard-won advantages. Tanks could not cross the hedgerows without climbing the embankment and exposing their thin belly armor to enemy fire. The moment a Sherman's nose rose above the hedgerow, it became a perfect target for waiting anti-tank weapons. Artillery forward observers could rarely see more than one field ahead, limiting their ability to call in effective support. Aircraft circling overhead had difficulty identifying targets hidden beneath the vegetation. The coordinated combined arms attacks that American doctrine demanded became fragmented in the bocage. Each field became a separate battle, isolated from adjacent engagements by impenetrable walls of earth and vegetation. The advantages that American forces possessed in open country, their mobility, their firepower concentration, their air-ground coordination, were neutralized by terrain that favored the defender absolutely. The first weeks after D-Day were brutal. Infantry divisions suffered casualty rates comparable to the worst fighting of World War I. The 29th Infantry Division took more than 3,700 casualties in the approaches to Saint-Lô. The 2nd Infantry Division suffered nearly 600 killed and 3,000 wounded in their repeated June and July assaults on Hill 192, finally wresting it from elite German paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division on July 11th. The 4th Infantry Division, which had landed on Utah Beach on D-Day, was fought almost to exhaustion in the bocage south of Cherbourg. German indirect fire, principally mortars, accounted for up to 75% of American casualties. Yet even as losses mounted, American commanders and soldiers adapted with a speed that demonstrated the fundamental soundness of their training and doctrine. The solution to the hedgerow problem came not from generals in headquarters, but from a sergeant in a cavalry reconnaissance unit, Curtis G. Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron proposed welding steel prongs to the front of Sherman tanks, using metal salvaged from German beach obstacles. These prongs would dig into the base of a hedgerow, allowing the tank to push through rather than climb over, keeping its vulnerable belly protected. On July 14, 1944, General Bradley watched a demonstration of the device. Tanks ploughed through hedgerows that had stopped them for weeks, throwing dirt and vegetation into the air but maintaining their combat stance with guns level and armor facing forward. Bradley immediately grasped the implications. Within 2 weeks, more than 500 tanks had been fitted with what soldiers called rhino tusks, or Kulin cutters, or hedgehog devices. By the time of Operation Cobra, roughly 60% of First Army's Shermans carried the modification. Simultaneously, American units developed tactical solutions that maximized their combined arms advantages even in the restrictive bocage terrain. The 29th Division pioneered what became the standard assault technique. A Sherman would fire white phosphorus rounds into the corners of a field, creating smoke and flame that blinded German machine gunners and forced them to cover. Engineers would blast a hole in the hedgerow with explosive charges, creating a gap for the tank to use. Infantry would advance through the gap behind the tank, using its bulk as cover while they cleared the field. Artillery and mortars would suppress any German positions that revealed themselves. This was combined arms warfare reduced to its smallest scale, the coordinated action of infantry, armor, engineers, and artillery to clear a single Norman field perhaps 200 yards across. It was slow, it was costly, and it was absolutely necessary. Field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, American forces ground their way toward the road junction at Saint-Lô that would become the launch point for the breakout. The capture of Saint-Lô on July 18, 1944, set the stage for the operation that would break the German army in France. General Bradley's plan for Operation Cobra was brutally simple in concept, though demanding in execution. Overwhelming air power would blast a corridor through German lines. Armored divisions would exploit the gap before the Germans could recover. Once in open country beyond the bocage, American mobility and firepower would become decisive. The bombardment that opened Cobra on July 25th was the heaviest tactical airstrike of the war to that point. 1,500 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force dropped more than 3,000 tons of high explosives and fragmentation bombs on a target area roughly 7 miles long and 1 mile deep. Behind them came nearly 400 medium bombers and more than 500 fighter bombers, adding more explosives, more fragmentation bombs, and napalm. The effects on German defenders were catastrophic beyond anything they had experienced even on the Eastern Front. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr Division in the path of the bombardment, later described the experience in terms that have become among the most quoted words in the historiography of World War II. "The planes kept coming overhead like a conveyor belt," he said. "The bomb carpets came down. By midday the entire area resembled a moonscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. 70% of his forward troops were dead, wounded, crazed, or numb. Several of his men went mad and rushed around in the open until they were cut down by splinters. The bombardment was not without tragedy for the Americans. Approximately 35 bombers of the 8th Air Force dropped their loads short of the target area, killing 111 American soldiers and wounding 490. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the architect of the Louisiana Maneuvers and commander of Army Ground Forces, who had come to France to observe the operation that his training reforms had made possible. His body was reportedly thrown dozens of feet by the blast and was identified only by the 3 stars on his collar. He remains the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre. But the German defensive line had been shattered. The 7th Corps, under Major General J. Lawton Collins, attacked into the smoking ruins and found resistance fragmentary and disorganized. Dazed survivors surrendered without fighting. Positions that had been prepared for weeks had simply ceased to exist. By July 26th, the breach was confirmed. By July 27th, armored columns were racing past stunned German survivors. By July 30th, Avranches had fallen, and the entire German position in Normandy was unraveling. In the days that followed the breakout, the American combined arms system operated at peak efficiency. Armored columns of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions advanced with fighter-bomber cover orbiting overhead. German attempts to establish defensive lines were detected from the air and shattered before they could solidify. Counterattacks withered under artillery concentrations that arrived within minutes of the first radio call for support. The speed of the American advance created a crisis that German commanders could not resolve with the tools available to them. Units that had held their positions for weeks found themselves bypassed, surrounded, cut off from supply and reinforcement. Communications broke down as headquarters were overrun or forced to flee. The orderly defensive warfare that German doctrine demanded became impossible when the front itself had ceased to exist as a coherent line. Hitler's response to the breakthrough made the catastrophe complete. On August 2nd, he ordered Field Marshal von Kluge to concentrate all available panzer divisions for a counterattack from Mortain toward Avranches. The goal was to cut off Patton's Third Army, which had just become operational, from its supply lines. If successful, the attack would restore the German position and perhaps turn the entire campaign. If it failed, it would push the remaining German armor deeper into a trap from which there would be no escape. The counterattack jumped off shortly after midnight on August 7, 1944. 4 panzer divisions, the 2nd Panzer, the 100, 16th Panzer, the 1st SS Leibstandarte, and the 2nd SS Das Reich, along with the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, attacked with approximately 300 tanks. They achieved initial surprise and penetrated several miles into American positions. But American intelligence, aided by decrypted German communications from Bletchley Park, had anticipated the attack. Reinforcements were already moving into blocking positions. 12.5 artillery battalions, including 3 of 155mm long Tom howitzers, were concentrated to support the defensive sector. When dawn came and the weather cleared, the Luftwaffe support that Hitler had promised failed to materialize. Instead, Allied fighter bombers fell upon the exposed German columns with rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire. On Hill 314, overlooking the German assembly areas, approximately 700 men of the 120th Infantry Regiment were surrounded but refused to surrender. 2 young lieutenants from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, Robert Weiss and Charles Bartz, directed the massed fires of all 12 artillery battalions onto every German concentration they could observe. For 5 days, until relief arrived on August 12th, this isolated force served as the eyes of the American artillery, calling down devastation on any German unit foolish enough to move in daylight. The Mortain counterattack cost the Germans approximately 120 tanks and assault guns, more than 2/3 of those committed. The promised Luftwaffe support never arrived in meaningful strength. German pilots who attempted to reach the battlefield were intercepted and shot down before they could effect the ground fighting. The American Air Force and the Royal Air Force owned the sky absolutely and used that ownership with devastating effect. The failure at Mortain left the German armies in Normandy caught in a closing trap. To the north, British and Canadian forces pressed southward. To the west, American forces held the shoulder. To the south and east, Patton's Third Army swept around the German flank in a vast envelopment. The only escape route lay through a narrowing gap between Falaise and Argentan, and that gap was shrinking daily. What happened in that gap during the 3rd week of August 1944 remains one of the most devastating military defeats in recorded history. German units attempting to flee eastward were attacked from both flanks and from above without respite. Columns of vehicles, horses, and men were caught on roads that became killing grounds. Fighter bombers circled like vultures, attacking anything that moved. The scenes in the Falaise Pocket defied description. Roads were blocked by the wreckage of trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, and horse-drawn wagons. The bodies of men and animals lay in heaps that had to be cleared before surviving vehicles could pass. The smell of death hung over the entire valley and could be detected miles away. An RAF officer who flew over the pocket described roads choked with wreckage and swollen bodies of men and horses, with human remains hanging in grotesque shapes from blackened hedgerows. When the pocket was finally closed on August 21st, the German losses were staggering. Approximately 10,000 dead were counted on the battlefield. 50,000 prisoners were taken. 500 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned. The divisions trapped in the pocket, including some of the finest formations in the German army, emerged as shattered remnants incapable of sustained combat. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which had entered Normandy with more than 20,000 men in June, emerged from Falaise with its combat elements reduced to 10 tanks, 300 fighting men, and no artillery. The paper strength of roughly 12,000 survivors masked a division that no longer existed as a fighting force. General Eisenhower walked the battlefield 48 hours after the fighting ended. What he saw stayed with him for the rest of his life. The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing grounds of any of the war areas, he wrote later, scenes that could be described only by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The pattern established in Normandy repeated itself across France, into Belgium, and finally into Germany itself. American combined arms doctrine, refined in combat, supported by overwhelming industrial output, and executed by troops who learned from their mistakes, proved irresistible to German forces that could not match any element of the American system. At the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945, the Germans achieved complete surprise and initial success. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft for the critical first days. German forces penetrated deep into American lines. At Bastogne, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division arrived before the paratroopers and fought the initial delaying actions that made the defense possible. The 101st Airborne Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and engineers held out against repeated assaults. When a German delegation demanded surrender on December 22, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe gave his famous one-word reply: nuts. When the weather cleared on December 23, the American system came back with terrible efficiency. Fighter bombers struck German columns. Artillery decimated infantry caught in the open. The proximity fuze, released for ground use just days before the German attack, turned American artillery shells into massacre weapons that exploded above German foxholes with lethal effect. On December 26, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led his tank battalion through German lines to relieve Bastogne. The combined arms system had held together under maximum stress, and the German offensive ground to a halt. American casualties were severe, approximately 90,000, including more than 19,000 killed. But German losses were devastating, between 80 and 100,000 men, and virtually all the armor committed. The strategic reserve that Hitler had assembled for one final blow was destroyed. The final demonstration of combined arms supremacy came in the Ruhr Pocket in April of 1945. American forces encircled Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model, trapping approximately 317,000 German soldiers in an ever-shrinking perimeter. The troops under Model's command came from perhaps 19 division remnants, but only 20% possessed infantry weapons. The rest were support troops, headquarters personnel, and men without units, caught in a pocket from which there was no escape. Model had once written that a field marshal does not become a prisoner. Such a thing is simply not possible. On April 21, 1945, facing the complete collapse of his command and unwilling to surrender, he walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. The mass surrender that followed was the largest in the Western European theatre. More prisoners were taken in the Ruhr than the Germans had captured at Stalingrad. The German infantryman who faced American combined arms in 1944 and 1945 was not inferior in courage, training, or individual tactical skill. At the personal level, German soldiers repeatedly demonstrated initiative and determination that their American opponents respected. German defensive positions were expertly sighted. German counterattacks were aggressively executed. German junior leaders showed remarkable ability to maintain cohesion under pressure that would have broken lesser troops. But individual excellence could not overcome systemic disadvantage. When a German company commander prepared to defend a position, he could not call upon fighter-bomber support because the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective force. He could not count on adequate artillery support because shells were rationed and guns were outnumbered. He could not expect armored reinforcement because tanks were immobilized for lack of fuel or held in reserve by distant commanders. He could not retreat to better ground because Hitler had forbidden it. His American counterpart commanded a system. Before attacking, he could request and expect an artillery preparation that would suppress enemy positions. He could coordinate with tank units that would provide direct fire support. He could call upon aircraft that would arrive within minutes to strike targets beyond the range of his organic weapons. He fought not alone but as part of an integrated network that multiplied his combat power. This asymmetry, not numbers alone, explains the outcome. Germany produced more tanks in 1944 than in any previous year. German infantry divisions continued to arrive through the final months. German weapons were in many cases superior to American equivalents, but none of these advantages could compensate for the collapse of the systems that German combined arms warfare required. The American victory was forged not only on battlefields but in factories and training camps. The Sherman tank was not the best tank of World War II, but it was produced in quantities that allowed losses to be replaced overnight. American artillery shells were not more deadly than German ones, but they were available in quantities that German gunners could not imagine. American pilots were not inherently superior, but they received more training, flew better maintained aircraft, and had unlimited fuel. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the West in the final months, summarized the situation with a metaphor that captured German despair. Fighting with the forces available, he said, was like trying to play a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, out-of-tune piano. The music was in his head. The instrument could not produce it. For the German infantry soldier in his foxhole, watching American fighter bombers circle overhead while American artillery churned the ground around him and American tanks approached through gaps blasted in the hedgerows, there was nothing to be done. He could fight with extraordinary bravery. He could inflict casualties that would be mourned in American homes. But he could not win. The system arrayed against him was too powerful, too coordinated, too well supplied to be stopped. This is why German infantry struggled against American combined arms tactics. They faced not an army but a method of warfare that had been developed, tested, refined, and executed with resources Germany could not match. Their own supports, the air power, the fuel, the reserves, the rational command, had been stripped away by strategic failures and enemy action. They fought with courage that deserves remembrance. They lost because courage alone could not overcome a system built to make individual heroism irrelevant.